The gas station sat in the middle of nowhere, wrapped in the suffocating embrace of endless woods and a blackened sky. It was the kind of place where the air felt heavy, carrying the faint metallic tang of gasoline and despair. No one came here unless they absolutely had to, and even then they didn't linger. Yet every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I was stuck there, manning the graveyard shift. The first oddity was the silence. During the day, the station had its usual share of mundane chatter, the hum of engines and the occasional laughter of kids grabbing snacks. At night, everything changed. No wind stirred, no animals called from the woods. It was like the world was holding its breath. It started on a Tuesday, my second week on the job. Around 2:30 a.m., as I wiped down the counter for the third time, I noticed headlights approaching. A beat-up pickup truck rolled into the lot, its engine sputtering before dying altogether. The driver, a wiry man with hollow eyes and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, stepped out. He didn't acknowledge me, just started pumping gas. Only the pump wasn't working. "Hey," I called out, stepping outside. "The pump's off until you prepay." The man turned his head, slow and deliberate, his eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. There was nothing in his gaze, no anger, no recognition, nothing human. Without a word, he climbed back into his truck and drove off, the pump handle still dangling. Shaking it off, I went back inside. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I checked the security cameras, scanned the dark perimeter, but saw nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, prickling at the back of my neck. The next night, it got worse. Around 1 a.m., I heard faint tapping on the glass doors. When I looked up, no one was there. I chalked it up to my imagination until it happened again, louder this time. I stepped out to check, flashlight in hand, but the lot was empty, the woods beyond it impenetrable in the dark. When I turned to go back in, I noticed footprints in the dew-covered asphalt. Bare, human footprints, leading from the woods to the door, but stopping abruptly as if the person had vanished into thin air. My hands shook as I locked the door and resolved to stay behind the counter for the rest of the night. The following evening, I asked the morning clerk, Carol, about the station's history. She hesitated before telling me about the disappearances. 3 people, all employees, had vanished without a trace over the past decade. Police found no evidence of foul play, but locals whispered about something lurking in the woods, something that didn't want the station here. That night, the power went out just after midnight. The darkness was absolute, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. My flashlight cast long, jittery shadows as I stumbled around, trying to restore the breakers. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a moan. It came from the back storage room. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The sound stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt alive. Against every instinct, I opened the door to the storage room. The flashlight beam revealed rows of shelves, most of them covered in dust. But at the far end, something moved. It was subtle, a shifting of shadows, but enough to send a cold wave of terror through me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. The shadow stepped forward, resolving into a figure that was impossibly tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by a veil of darkness. It didn't walk, it glided toward me. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, just bolted for the front door. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers slick with sweat, as I heard the thing behind me. Its movement was a wet, dragging sound, like flesh against concrete. When I finally got the door open, I burst into the lot, gasping for air. The night was silent again, the oppressive weight gone. But the moment I stepped out, I realized my mistake. The woods, the gas pumps, everything was wrong. The world around me felt warped, like I'd stepped into a distorted mirror version of reality. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the woods, watching. It raised a long, spindly hand and pointed at me. Then it smiled, its face splitting open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. I don't remember getting home. I woke up the next morning in my bed, my clothes from the night before damp and reeking of gasoline. I quit that day, but sometimes late at night, I hear tapping on my bedroom window, and I know it's still watching, waiting for me to come back.
Story number 2.
The diner clock struck midnight, its chime echoing faintly across the deserted road. For most people, it marked the end of another day. For me, it signaled the beginning of the graveyard shift at a desolate gas station 20 miles outside town. A lonely speck of neon surrounded by miles of dense, shadowy woods. The place always had a sinister aura. Customers would joke about it being the perfect setting for a horror movie, but the jokes felt hollow, as if even they sensed the unease. Over the past year, I'd grown used to the eerie stillness, the suffocating quiet punctuated only by the occasional hum of passing cars. But that night was different. That night, the station didn't feel merely empty. It felt wrong. It started small. At 1:45 a.m., the overhead lights began flickering. I glanced up from the counter, annoyed but unsurprised. The station's wiring was ancient, and outages were common. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed outside to check the breaker box. The cold night air bit at my skin as I fumbled with the lock. Behind me, I heard a faint sound, a low, wet, crunching noise. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hand. Turning slowly, I scanned the lot. It was empty, just the skeletal silhouettes of the pumps and the deep black beyond the tree line. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a deer and forced myself back to work. By the time I returned inside, the lights had stabilized. I sighed with relief, but my relief was short-lived. The smell hit me first, coppery, metallic, and overpowering. It filled my lungs, making my stomach churn. I followed it to the restroom where I found the source. The walls were smeared with a dark, viscous liquid. It was thick and smelled unmistakably like blood. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I reached for my radio to call the manager, but the static that answered wasn't normal. Beneath the crackle, there was a faint voice, a low, sing-song tone that repeated one word over and over, "Run." I dropped the radio, its voice still hissing faintly as I stumbled back to the front of the store. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, but something made me stop. Through the wide glass window, I saw a figure standing by pump 4. It wasn't a customer. It couldn't be. The figure was impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes were black pits that seemed to absorb the weak fluorescent light. It stood completely still, except for its fingers, which twitched and curled as if beckoning me. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when the phone rang. The sharp sound nearly made me scream. With trembling hands, I picked it up. "Hello?" I whispered. The voice on the other end was barely audible, drowned in static. But I could make out one word, repeated again and again. "Behind." I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But I felt it. Felt the air shift, the warmth of something standing far too close. My vision blurred, and a faint buzzing filled my ears as a cold hand brushed against the back of my neck. I bolted for the door, flinging it open and running into the night. I didn't stop, not until I reached the main road. Gasping for air, I turned back. The gas station was still there, its neon sign flickering feebly, but the figure was gone. The parking lot was empty, the woods eerily still. I never went back. The manager called me the next day, furious that I'd abandoned my shift. He told me nothing was out of place when he arrived that morning. No blood, no figure, no signs of anything unusual. But I know what I saw. Sometimes late at night I dream of that figure, of its black, empty eyes and its cold, twitching fingers. And in those dreams, it doesn't stand still, it moves closer.
Story number 3.
The gas station on the edge of town was an anomaly. A lonely, decrepit structure surrounded by cornfields that stretched endlessly in every direction. It wasn't on any maps, and no one I asked seemed to remember when it had first opened. Locals called it the last stop, and I soon found out why. The place was a magnet for the weird, the unsettling, and the inexplicable. I took the job reluctantly, desperate for cash, and figured the night shifts would be boring at worst. But boredom was the least of my concerns after my third shift. It started around 1 a.m. when the hum of the fluorescent lights above my head grew erratic, stuttering and buzzing like an angry swarm of bees. I glanced up, annoyed, and noticed movement on the security cameras. One of the exterior cameras, pointed toward the farthest pump, showed a figure standing in the shadows. The figure didn't move. It was tall, unnervingly so, with limbs that seemed too thin to support its frame. It stood just at the edge of the camera's view, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, staring at the pump. I hesitated, debating whether to go out and check. The parking lot was empty except for the figure, and no cars had pulled in for over an hour. I tapped the microphone to the intercom. "Hey, you need any help out there?" No response. The figure didn't even flinch. I watched it for a while longer, hoping it would move, not leave, or at least give me a reason to think it was human. Instead, it slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at the camera. At me. A chill ran down my spine. My hands hovered over the phone, ready to call the police, but something stopped me. The longer I stared at the figure, the more distorted it looked on the screen. Its outline shimmered, bending in and out of focus like a mirage. Then the screen went black. I stood frozen, listening as the lights above me buzzed louder, the sound rising to a deafening crescendo before they all went out. The store plunged into darkness. Grabbing my flashlight, I scanned the aisles, my breath hitching with every creak of the building. The emergency lights near the exit doors cast a dim red glow, making the shadows stretch and writhe like living things. That's when I heard it. A low, scraping sound coming from the back storage room. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone dragging a heavy object across the concrete floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "If someone's back there, this isn't funny." The scraping stopped. For a moment there was silence, thick and suffocating. Then, from the same room, I heard my name. It wasn't shouted or whispered. It was spoken in a calm, flat tone, spoken in my own voice. I nearly dropped the flashlight as I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Gathering what little courage I had, I crept toward the storage room, flashlight beam jittering against the walls. The room was empty. The shelves stood as they always did, cluttered with cleaning supplies and spare inventory. But in the center of the floor, scratched into the concrete, was a single word: stay. I didn't need a second warning. I bolted for the front door, but as I reached it, the glass windows lit up with movement. Shapes swarmed outside, dozens of them, shadowy figures that pressed against the glass, their hands and faces leaving smudges as they clawed and pushed. Their eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow light that made my stomach churn. They weren't human. They couldn't be. The way they moved was jerky, broken, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. I locked the door and backed away, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, the figures vanished. No sound, no trace, just an empty lot staring back at me. The lights flickered back on. The hum of the fluorescents filled the silence, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The scratches on the floor were still there, and I could feel something watching, waiting. I didn't wait for my shift to end. I left the store, leaving the doors unlocked and the lights on, and drove as fast as I could. The next day, I called to quit. The manager didn't seem surprised. "They don't usually let people leave so easily," he said, his tone flat. "You're lucky." I've never gone back, but sometimes late at night I hear scraping sounds outside my bedroom window. And every so often I see a faint, flickering light in the distance. The neon sign of the last stop, beckoning.
Story number 4.
The gas station on Route 72 had always been an unremarkable blip on the map, a forgotten pit stop for weary travelers. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, casting the pumps and the store in a sickly yellow glow. It was isolated, surrounded by miles of flat desert and a dark horizon that seemed to stretch forever. I never liked working the night shift there, but the pay was decent, and I needed the money. The first sign that something was wrong came at 12:13 a.m. I know the exact time because I had been counting the minutes until my shift ended. I was restocking the shelves when I heard the faint sound of a car engine idling. Peeking through the window, I saw an old, rusted sedan parked by the far pump. The car wasn't running, but there was no one inside. I waited for someone to come in, but after 5 minutes, no one appeared. Feeling uneasy, I stepped outside. The desert air was still and suffocating. I approached the car cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Do you need help?" No answer. I shone my flashlight into the car, but the interior was empty. The keys were still in the ignition, swinging gently, as if someone had just left. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. My skin prickled as I stepped back toward the store. When I got inside, the smell hit me. It was faint at first, a sickly sweet odor that clung to the back of my throat. I followed it to the restroom. My hand hesitated on the door handle, but I pushed it open. The room was empty, but the mirror was fogged over, as if someone had just taken a hot shower. A single handprint, too large and distorted to be human, was smeared in the condensation. My reflection looked wrong, too. It seemed to lag a second behind my movements, its eyes fixed on me, even when I turned away. I backed out of the restroom, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when the lights went out. The store plunged into darkness, save for the faint green glow of the emergency exit signs. My phone's flashlight barely cut through the gloom as I fumbled for the breaker box in the back room. Then the tapping started. It was soft at first, like fingernails against glass. It came from the front of the store, near the windows. I froze, my hand hovering over the breakers. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Slowly, I turned my head, shining the flashlight toward the sound. At first, I thought the windows were empty. But then I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them. Pressed against the glass. Pale, expressionless faces with wide, empty eyes and mouths that opened and closed silently, as if trying to speak. They weren't people. They couldn't be. Their features were too smooth, their movements too jerky. The tapping turned to pounding. The glass vibrated with the force of it. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stack of boxes, and slammed the breaker switch. The lights flickered back on. The windows were empty. No faces, no smudges, nothing. Just the quiet hum of the lights and the faint smell of burnt plastic. I was done. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the exit. As I stepped outside, I froze. The car was gone. In its place was a long, dark smear on the pavement, leading off into the desert. The trail glistened under the lights, as though something wet and massive had been dragged away. I didn't stick around to investigate. I drove home as fast as I could, my heart pounding the entire way. I quit the next morning. The manager didn't seem surprised. He just nodded and muttered something about another one gone. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. But sometimes when I pass by Route 72, I see that gas station in the distance, and I swear I can still hear the tapping.
Story number 5.
The gas station was perched on a desolate stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but endless pine trees. Locals called it Widow's Station, though no one ever explained why. Maybe it was the way the fog clung to the ground every night, or the way travelers who stopped there always seemed to drive away faster than they arrived. I worked the night shift there, and the routine was usually the same. Stock shelves, clean up spills, and occasionally sell snacks to exhausted truckers. But one night, something came through that I can never forget. It was just past 2 a.m., and I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. The place was quiet, the kind of oppressive silence that makes every small sound echo. Then I heard the bell above the door chime. A man walked in, though man might not be the right word. He was tall, too tall, and his proportions were all wrong. His arms hung slightly too low, and his head tilted unnaturally to one side. He wore an old, tattered suit that smelled faintly of mildew and gasoline. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond, just shuffled toward the back of the store. I watched him on the security monitors as he moved slowly through the aisles, touching random items but not picking anything up. His movements were strange, jerky, like he was figuring out how his body worked as he went. After a while, I looked back at the live feed, only to realize he wasn't on the camera anymore. I blinked, leaned closer. He'd been in the middle of an aisle just seconds ago, but now it was empty. "Sir?" I called, stepping out from behind the counter. "Store's about to close." No response. I checked the aisles one by one, but he wasn't there. The door hadn't opened again, and there was no way he could have left without me noticing. My gut twisted. As I rounded the corner toward the cooler section, the smell hit me, rotting meat, thick and cloying. I gagged, covering my nose as I shone my flashlight into the dimly lit back aisle. He was there, standing perfectly still, his back to me, head tilted at that unnatural angle. In his hand was a pack of gum, held so tightly it was crumpling. "Sir," I said, my voice shaking, "we're closed. You need to leave." Slowly, impossibly slowly, he turned his head toward me. Not his body, just his head, swiveling like it was on a hinge. His face was slack, expressionless, but his eyes, they locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice raspy and wet like he hadn't spoken in years. Before I could respond, he dropped the gum and glided toward the restroom door. I stood frozen, my heart pounding as the door creaked open and slammed shut behind him. For a long moment, I didn't move. The store was silent again, but I could feel something wasn't right. Gathering every ounce of courage, I approached the restroom. My hand shook as I knocked on the door. "Sir?" I called. No answer. I pushed the door open and my stomach dropped. The restroom was empty, completely empty. There were no windows, no vents large enough for someone to crawl through. Just a cracked mirror above the sink and a single stall with the door hanging slightly ajar. As I stepped inside, the smell of rot grew stronger. My flashlight flickered, and I saw something move in the mirror. Not behind me, but in the reflection. A shadow, darker than the room itself, shifted in the glass. I backed away, but the shadow moved closer, its shape becoming more defined. It was him, the man in the suit. Only now his features were sharper, his mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. "Stay," the reflection hissed, its voice echoing in the small room. I didn't. I ran. By the time I made it back to the counter, the bell above the door chimed again. I spun around, expecting to see him, but there was no one there, just the night, silent and still. The next morning, I told my manager everything, but he just laughed it off. "Oh, you met him, huh?" he said. "Yeah, he comes around sometimes. Just leave him be." I quit that day. I still drive past Widow Station occasionally, but I never stop. Even from the road, I swear I can see a figure standing in the window, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the bell chime, even when I'm home.
Story number 6.
The gas station on County Road 47 was the last outpost of civilization for miles. Beyond it, the road stretched into an endless expanse of swamp and dense, misty woods. The locals whispered about strange happenings in those woods. Lights that danced without a source, voices calling your name in the dark, but I never paid attention. That is, until the night it happened to me. It was my first solo night shift, and the station was deathly quiet. The only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerators and the occasional rustle of the wind against the windows. Around 2 a.m., just as I was starting to doze off at the counter, the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in, his boots squelching with wet mud. He was soaked, like he'd been walking through the swamp for hours. His clothes hung heavily on him, and his face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed and hollow. "Help you find something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He wandered the aisles aimlessly, his shoulders hunched. I watched him on the security monitor, every instinct in my body screaming that something was off. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he was studying each item but didn't know what they were. After a few minutes, he came to the counter and placed a single item down, a can of gas station brand coffee. His hand trembled as he pushed it toward me. "That all?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He nodded, but when he opened his mouth, his voice didn't match his appearance. It was deep and guttural, like two voices speaking at once. "Do you know the way back?" "The way back?" I repeated, confused. He nodded again, but this time his eyes rolled back into his head for a moment, leaving only the whites. When they returned, he stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I've been walking. So long. I can't find it." "Where are you trying to go?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, the lights flickered. The wind outside picked up, howling against the windows. A chill seeped into the store, so cold it felt unnatural. The man turned abruptly and walked out the door without another word. I stared after him, heart pounding. He disappeared into the darkness beyond the pumps, but when I checked the security cameras, he wasn't there. Just the empty lot. I told myself it was nothing, just a drifter passing through, but I couldn't shake the unease. I locked the door and went back to my stool behind the counter, keeping one eye on the monitors. That's when I saw it. Something was moving in the woods. It wasn't the man. This thing was taller, impossibly so, with long, spindly limbs that swayed unnaturally as it walked. It didn't look human. It stopped just at the edge of the tree line, swaying, watching. Its head tilted, and though the camera's resolution wasn't great, I could feel its gaze boring into me. I grabbed the phone and dialed the manager. As the line rang, I glanced back at the monitor. The figure was gone. "Hey, kid," the manager said groggily when he picked up. "What's wrong?" "There's something outside," I said, my voice shaking. "Something in the woods." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice that was far too calm, he said, "Don't look at it." "What?" "Whatever you do, don't look at it. Stay inside, keep the lights on, and wait for dawn." "What is it?" I demanded, but he hung up. The next few hours were the longest of my life. I stayed behind the counter, the phone clutched in my hand, staring at the monitors. The figure didn't appear again, but I could hear it. Scraping sounds against the building, faint whispers that seemed to come from the vents. At one point, the bell above the door chimed again. I froze, staring at the door. It was still locked. No one had come in. but the sound of wet footsteps echoed across the tile floor. I didn't dare look up. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the footsteps faded. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, the oppressive chill lifted. The store felt normal again, as if nothing had happened. I quit that morning. As I was leaving, the manager was waiting in the parking lot. He handed me my final check without a word, but as I turned to go, he said something that still haunts me. "You're lucky. Most people who see it don't make it to the morning."
Story number 7.
The gas station on Old Hollow Road was infamous among locals for being strange. It wasn't just the fact that it sat isolated, surrounded by dense woods with no cell signal. It was the stories. People claimed the clocks never worked there, that time felt slower. Some even said they'd driven past it only to find it wasn't there the next day. I didn't believe the rumors, but when I needed a job, I took the night shift without hesitation. It was my second week when things started to go wrong. The first sign was the radio. Around midnight, the crackly pop station I kept on for background noise suddenly went silent. A few seconds later, it came back on, but the music was warped, distorted, like it was playing underwater. Then a voice came through, faint and hollow. "Help me." I froze, staring at the radio as static swallowed the sound. My hands were shaking as I turned it off. I told myself it was just interference, some trucker CB bleeding through, but deep down, I didn't believe it. At 1:15 a.m., the lights flickered, and that's when the first customer of the night arrived. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up to see a young woman walk in. She was soaking wet, her clothes clinging to her like she'd just climbed out of a lake. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her bare feet left puddles on the floor. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. Instead, she walked straight to the back aisle and stopped, staring at the rows of canned soup. Her back was to me, and she didn't move for a long time. "Ma'am?" I tried again. Slowly, she turned her head, not her body, just her head, until she was staring at me over her shoulder. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her lips slightly parted as though she was about to speak. Then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It stretched too far, revealing teeth that looked jagged and wrong. My stomach turned, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But before I could move, she turned back to the shelf and picked up a can of soup. Her movements were jerky, like a marionette on tangled strings. She brought the can to the counter and placed it down gently. "That'll be $1.79, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't reach for her wallet. Instead, she leaned in close, her wet hair dripping onto the counter. I could smell the damp earth on her. When she spoke, her voice was raspy, like she hadn't used it in years. "Don't look outside." "What?" Her head twitched, the smile returning. "Don't look outside." "Not tonight." Then she turned and walked out, leaving the soup behind. I watched her through the window as she disappeared into the woods, her figure swallowed by the shadows. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia. Every time the lights flickered, I jumped. Every sound, the hum of the cooler, the creak of the building, felt too loud. But I didn't look outside. I didn't even glance at the window, no matter how strong the urge was. At 3:33 a.m., the power went out completely. The store plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the blackness as I tried to find the breaker box in the back room. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping on the glass. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails against a window. Tap, tap, tap. I gripped the flashlight tightly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the glass. Then it stopped. The silence was worse. I stayed in the back room, too afraid to move. When the power came back on, 15 minutes later, I hesitated before stepping out. The store looked normal until I saw the windows. They were covered in handprints, hundreds of them smeared across the glass. Some were small, like children's hands. Others were large, impossibly large. They trailed down the glass in streaks as if whoever or whatever had been out there was dragging its fingers across the surface. I didn't finish my shift. I grabbed my keys and left, speeding down Old Hollow Road without looking back. When I told my manager the next day, he didn't seem surprised. "You're lucky," he said with a shrug. "Most people who work the night shift don't get warnings." I quit that same day. But sometimes when I drive past the gas station at night, I catch a glimpse of something moving in the woods. and when the lights flicker in my house, I hear the faint sound of tapping echoing in the dark.
Story number 8.
The gas station sat at the crossroads of two forgotten highways, surrounded by a sea of tall grass that whispered in the wind like 1,000 hushed voices. It was the kind of place that felt like it existed outside of time, where the clock always seemed stuck at 3:33 a.m. The pay wasn't great, but I figured it would be an easy gig until my third week on the night shift. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. I was stocking the cooler when I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside. Through the window, I saw headlights in the distance, faint but growing closer. When the car pulled up, it was a classic, a 1950s Chevrolet, gleaming like it had just rolled off the assembly line. The driver stepped out, a man in a black suit and fedora, his face hidden in shadow. He moved slowly, deliberately, and as he approached the door, I noticed something strange. The lights from the gas station didn't reflect in his eyes. They were flat, dull, almost like polished stone. "Evening," he said, his voice smooth but empty, like the words were rehearsed. "Can I help you?" I tried to sound normal despite the unease crawling up my spine. "I'm just passing through," he said, smiling. His teeth were too white, too perfect, like a mannequin's. "I need to fill up." I nodded and turned to the register, expecting him to head back outside to the pumps, but he didn't move. When I looked up, he was staring at me, unblinking. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked suddenly. I guess," I stammered, unsure how to respond. He smiled wider, his lips stretching too far. "Good. Fate brought me here. Fate brought you here." Before I could say anything else, he turned and walked out. I watched him fill his tank on the security monitor, moving with a strange precision. When he was done, he climbed back into the car and drove off without paying. That should have been the end of it, but an hour later, the same car pulled in again. The exact same car. The same driver. He stepped out, tipped his hat to me through the window, and repeated the exact same routine, filling the tank, climbing back in, and driving off without paying. I stared at the security feed in disbelief. The timestamp showed the first visit had been at 1:12 a.m. The second, 2:12 a.m. Exactly 1 hour apart. By the third time he pulled in, my nerves were shot. I locked the door and watched from behind the counter as he repeated the routine, as if on a loop. This time, though, he didn't drive off right away. He parked his car by the pumps and stared at the store, his face obscured in shadow. Then he walked to the glass door and knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't answer. I didn't move. He pressed his face to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. For the first time, I could see his eyes clearly, or rather, the absence of them. His eye sockets were hollow, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. "Let me in," he whispered, his voice low and crackling like static. "You're part of this. You belong to it." I shook my head, backing away. His smile widened, revealing rows of jagged teeth that hadn't been there before. When he knocked again, the lights in the store flickered and the radio crackled to life, spewing distorted voices. It was like dozens of people were whispering all at once, their words overlapping and incomprehensible. The man outside began to laugh, the sound grating and hollow as though it were coming from a broken speaker. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The lights steadied. The radio went silent, and the man? He was gone. The car was gone. The parking lot was empty. I stayed behind the counter, shaking, until my shift ended at sunrise. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't think anyone would believe me. But the next night, when I came back to work, there was something new waiting for me. A photograph pinned to the bulletin board by the entrance. It was old, faded, and showed the gas station from decades ago. Standing in front of it was a man in a black suit and fedora, smiling. In his hand was a gas can, and behind him, barely visible in the background, was the car. The same car. I quit that night. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I see headlights in my rearview mirror. And for just a moment, I swear I hear that laughter again, faint and distorted, echoing in the distance.
Story number 9.
The gas station I worked at was on the edge of town, the kind of place where the lights barely held back the darkness of the surrounding woods. The night shifts were lonely, but I didn't mind. At least, not until that night. It started just after midnight. The parking lot was empty, and the only sound was the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights. I was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up to see a man walk in. He was wrong. His face was pale, almost gray, and he had a strange stiffness to his movements, like he wasn't used to walking. His clothes were tattered and old-fashioned, a worn suit that looked like it belonged in the 1920s. But the worst part was his eyes. They were completely black, like two pits of darkness. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, unblinking, for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a word, he turned and walked down one of the aisles. I watched him on the security monitor. He wasn't looking at the shelves or picking anything up. He just stood there, facing the wall. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to approach him. "Sir, do you need anything?" He turned his head slowly, far too slowly, until he was looking at me. Up close, I noticed something else. His skin wasn't just pale. It looked damp, like he'd been pulled from a lake. "Have you seen them?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Seen who?" I asked, my stomach twisting. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They're coming." Before I could ask what he meant, the lights flickered. When they came back on, he was gone. I checked the cameras, but there was no sign of him leaving. The parking lot was still empty. I told myself it was just some weirdo playing a prank. But then the noises started, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the windows. I walked over to check, but no one was there. The sound moved around the building as if someone or something was circling it. Tap! 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 I locked the doors, my hands shaking, and went back behind the counter. The tapping stopped, replaced by a new sound, a faint scratching like nails against wood. It was coming from the back room. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. The scratching stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the door to the back room creaked open. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a metal flashlight, and slowly made my way toward the door. The room was dark, but I could see a faint outline of something standing in the corner. It was tall and hunched, its limbs too long for its body. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure turned its head toward me, and I realized it wasn't a man. Its face was smooth and featureless, except for its mouth. A wide, jagged grin filled with sharp teeth. It took a step toward me, and I bolted, running out the front door and into the parking lot. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then, I could feel it watching me. When I looked back at the gas station, the lights were flickering again. In the window, I saw the man in the suit, staring out at me with those black, empty eyes. Standing behind him was the thing from the back room, its grin glowing faintly in the dark. I never went back to that gas station. They called me the next day to ask why I'd left mid-shift, but I couldn't explain. How do you tell someone you were chased out by something that shouldn't exist? Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tapping. And when I close my eyes, I see that grin, wide and sharp, waiting in the darkness.